welcome Bishnupriya Gupta from Warwick University today for our latest episode of the GrowthChat podcast. And Bishnu today will tell us a bit more about a recent Tawny lecture given to the Economic History Society a few years ago and published in the Economic History Review. And the title of the lecture was Falling Behind and Catching Up, India's Transition from a Colonial Economy. So we'll be talking about India over roughly 300-400 years. So Bishnu, maybe to get started, welcome again. It's wonderful to have you. Maybe to get us started, you could give us a brief timeline of Indian history in the last 400 years, from independence to colonization and out of it. And then we will continue from there.
Thanks a lot for having me on this program. It's a really nice program. So let me just start with the timeline of colonization. The European traders, which included the English, French, Dutch, the Danish, they arrived in India from the 17th centuries. And the purpose was to buy textiles. India was well known for these textile products, which were beautiful design and high quality. They wanted to buy these textiles and sell it in different markets, and particularly in the European market. So they signed trade treaties with the rulers at that time and set up trading posts in first along the western coast, and then along the eastern coast, and finally in Bengal. So what they did was they bought the textiles, but they paid for the textiles with bullion, because it sounds strange now. Indians did not care much about Western products. So bullion was imported into India and textiles were sold. The purchase of textiles was organized in these trading posts. In 1757, the East India Company in Bengal decided that it was better to fight this battle and get control of Bengal as a territory. So the Battle of 1757 gave East India Company the right to rule Bengal. And as a result, they had access to the revenue. And they used this revenue to buy textiles, and therefore all the bullion imports stopped. Over time, the company gradually expanded its territory in other parts of India. And in this process became more of a ruler than a trader. In 1858, the rule passed to the crown. So India formally was integrated into the British Empire in 1858. And from this point, it became part of the empire. So it kind of got connected into the trading connections of the British Empire by selling agricultural products such as cotton, raw cotton, and opium, and importing textiles from Britain. So it kind of became an agricultural producer in the course of 50, 60 years. And the transition to the crown rule had some important political economy implications, because now the British government in India could be lobbied by the British Parliament, and here the British interest groups were active. So on trade policy, on policies of labor laws, there was a lot of interference from British interest groups in what policies were brought in. In 1947, India finally became independent. And after that, most of the story. I guess it's common knowledge that, there was Nehru became the prime minister. India moved to an economy which was highly regulated. Since 1980s, it has been more liberal. There has been economic reforms and liberalization. And now we have independent governments in place.
Thank you. So I have a question here. We know that colonization hasn't been always good. was India falling behind during colonization, and what were the reasons for this underdevelopment?
So in 1600, which is in the data, that's how far we can go back at the moment. That's when India was quite prosperous relative to now. I mean, not now, but at the time of independence. And Indian GDP per capita was about 60% of British GDP capita at that time. But the decline began from the middle of the 17th century, both relative to Britain, but also in absolute terms, relative to its 1600 level. So the decline of Indian GDP per capita began well before colonization. During colonization, the divergence increased, but this was primarily because Britain was moving ahead fast. Indian GDP per capita stagnated mostly. There was a very brief period when there was a small growth, like less than 1% for several years, but this was very short-lived. And right up to 47, we more or less see stagnation of the Indian economy. And in particular, agriculture experienced stagnation throughout this period.
So during the colonization period, India also went through a process of industrialization, right? So it didn't just get bypassed completely. So what were the sectors that did develop, and how did they compare to, say, Britain or the rest of the world?
So when we look at the economic history writing or history writing of India, we see a big emphasis on the decline of this traditional textile industry in the 19th century. It's known as deindustrialization of India, a term deindustrialization coined well before it was used in the context of the advanced industrial countries. And people viewed this as a major event which led to the decline. In my work with Steve Broadberry, what we have found is this doesn't stand up to scrutiny. Although there was significant localized effects of decline of this traditional industry and workers went back to agriculture, overall effect on the economy was very small because this was a small part of the economy. So the decline of industries in the 19th century had very little effect on GDP per capita, for example. The other aspect of industry, the industrial sector, was a modern industry developed in India in the 19th century. This was in cotton textiles. So Indian traders who traded in raw cotton began to import textile machinery from Britain and set up textile firms. And this happened entirely under Indian entrepreneurship, mostly Indian entrepreneurs. Two other industries developed, which were jute and tea, and these developed in the eastern part of the country where the British capital was very important. And these industries were tea and jute. And here British entrepreneurs were really important. So you see these two divided regions, one of Western India, which was dominated by Indian entrepreneurs, and Eastern India, where British capital dominated. And this kind of shaped the way the industrial sector developed and has had some long-term consequences as well. I just want to also talk a little bit about agriculture and the stagnation of income, because this is the sector which is the largest part of the economy. And therefore, what was happening in agriculture was the main driver of GDP per capita. And in agriculture, there was, India was already quite populated in the fertile plains. As people began to move out of the fertile plains, land productivity began to fall. And nothing much was done to correct this. So the Mughal government had built some irrigation. The British built a significant system of irrigation in some parts of the country. And here we see some increase in land productivity. But for the rest of the country, only 20% of land was under irrigation. So the rest of the country saw stagnation of agricultural output. And that's what led to the overall stagnation of the economy.
So you mentioned about policy. I'm sure that the government needed to put into place different policy to allow this process of industrialization. Which policy were a success and which policy were clearly a failure during this period of time?
So I guess if we talk about probably the most successful policy is the construction of the railways. The railways were constructed from the middle of the 19th century, borrowing capital from Britain. But this capital, which came from Britain to set up Indian Railways, had a guaranteed rate of return, a rate of return of 5% per year, which was guaranteed by the government of India, the British government of India. So it was a very safe investment. And the railway network first connected ports to the hinterland. So for example, Bombay City was connected to the interior, which produced raw cotton, and Calcutta was connected to the hinterland, which produced jute and tea. But gradually over time, the railway network became much denser and connected different towns and cities of the whole country. So in that sense, it was successful in integrating markets. We know from the work of Dave Donaldson that there was increase in income in places where the railway line was connected. It also had some effect in reducing the incidence of famines, because by connecting places, it could now have grain transported from regions of plenty to regions of scarcity. So this, I think, is probably the most successful case of British investment in India. Another claim is that, by being part of the empire, India was a place where foreign investment could come. But in reality, this is not the case. I mean, there was foreign investment. For example, most of the tea companies were British owned. And if you think of it, tea was a product which was, consumed mainly in Britain. So this was a product familiar to the British investors. But if you look at the other industries, in raw cotton, in the cotton textile industry, it was Indian investment, which was the main investment. In jute industry, most of the investment came from British expatriates in India. So there wasn't flow of capital from Britain into India in any large magnitude. A third aspect which people have emphasized is, India got English education. And that is correct, because the metropolitan cities saw in universities being set up in the middle of the 19th century. So Calcutta, Delhi, Bombay, Madras. But at the time of independence, only 17% of Indian population was literate. So speaking about English literacy doesn't really mean much in this context. But what did happen is that there was an unusual emphasis on secondary and tertiary education. So for example, 40% of the Indian budget was spent on primary education compared to 80% spent in countries such as the United States and Japan or the United Kingdom. So this emphasis on secondary education actually saw some kind of skewed development of education. And primary education was also not prioritized in independent India. So, we have this very skilled workforce. We know that now. But this is a very selective group of people because of the structure of educational investments.
So you've already anticipated what I was going to ask, namely, what do you see as the legacies of the British rule? You mainly talk now about education and a kind of overemphasis on secondary education and too little in primary education. Are there other legacies of the British Empire?
So one important legacy of the British Empire, which is out there in the literature, which is work of Lakshmi Iyer and Abhijit Banerjee, and which looks at the two different systems of land revenue collections which the British brought in. They brought in these new systems because they thought when they arrived that the system of property rights in India was very loose. It was dependent on customary rights rather than legal rights. So in some regions, they gave the legal rights to the landlords who could then rent out land to the cultivators. In other regions, the land rights were given to the cultivators directly. So these two systems developed in very different ways. And the effect, the difference is particularly seen in the long term in terms of differences in agricultural productivity, even in independent India, and in differences in public spending. So this has been a persistent effect of colonial policy that we see even today. The second aspect is, as I said earlier, the second major consequence is the service sector, this emphasis on secondary education. And, Steve and I have speculated in our work that there is evidence that the service sector has relatively high productivity compared to, let's say, the UK. So if you look at the three sectors, the service sector has been catching up in terms of output per worker relative to Britain. And this is the sector which has the largest number of people with education. So not just primary education, but secondary and tertiary education. Whereas if you look at a sector like industry, there are lots of workers who do not have any education. So we speculated that this service sector advantage, which India has today, is likely to come from this emphasis on secondary education, which gave the service sector some advantage even in the colonial period. And that continues today.
Amazing.
Yeah,
so
thank you.
We can say that institutions matter at the end of the day. Now something more personal. What inspired you to become an economist?
So I actually wanted to study science, but there was an economic historian in the family. And I used to use their home to search through books. So I used to, their library was open to me. They were both academics. And I would go and sit in their library reading various books. And he convinced me to do economics. And so I started studying economics in my undergraduate degree. And then when I went to do my master's, he convinced me to do economic history, to specialize in economic history. So I think Ameya Bagchi, this is Ameya Bagchi, who I do not necessarily agree with his view of colonization, but he has had a big influence on me in terms of studying economic history and taking it further.
Yeah, we're asking these questions to everyone, so it's interesting to see what brought people to study economics.
So the other thing I is quite interesting that the syllabus of Calcutta University had in the undergraduate syllabus, they had a module which was comparative economic development. So I learned about the U.S. Economic history, the Russia and the Soviet economic history, and also Britain. And to be honest, I found British economic history the least interesting of all. I was fascinated by the Russian economic history and the American economic history. And I've always wanted to look at India in a comparative perspective.
Excellent. And the fact that you gave the Tawny lecture shows that you are now the authority on Indian economic history. And I really enjoyed reading the paper. So we are truly thankful that you gave us your time today and that we could have you as a guest. And we hope to see you again soon, talking about some of your ongoing and future research. thank you, Bishnu, for coming. Thank you.
Thank you both. That was a pleasure.